Welcome to the YouTube channel of Cascadia Living Wisdom. My name is David Benner, and today I want to talk with you about contemplation and meditation. Contemplation is the historic Christian term for this, but there are some differences between contemplation and meditation, as we'll see in a moment. And yet there's some very important overlap. And so we'll talk about those two together. And one of the things that I want to do is help you appreciate just the broad space that they occupy. And then we'll see why they are so important spiritually. And so let me share a slide, and we'll use this to guide us through our conversation. Let's start with some definitions and distinctions, so we're talking about the same things. Contemplation, as I say, has been the traditional Christian language for describing what we're talking about. And I'm going to define it in my own way. It's somewhat idiosyncratic, but it's what I see to be the essence of contemplation. Because contemplation itself can take many, many different forms. Sometimes it will be experienced and look like a form of prayer, contemplative prayer. But at other times, it's still very much similarly a prayer, but it's a way of living, it's a way of being, or it's a moment of reflection. So what is contemplation? Well, I would describe it as deep, heartful, reflective presence in openness to something. And there's a broad range of those somethings. To an image, to an object, to a word, to a thought, or a short passage. Let me just read that again. We'll think about it. It's deep. It's very deep. It's deeper than thinking. And one of the confusions in Christian understandings of contemplation is that we speak of discursive meditation, which is an old historic term for thinking about scriptures, but it's never just thinking. We'll see that it might involve thought, but it's never just thinking. It's deep because it involves the heart and it involves the body. It involves the totality of us, senses and imagination. So it's deep, heartful, reflective presence in openness to something. Not to my thoughts. So it's not to my thoughts about God. It's not simply like worded prayer in that regard. It may be to a passage from the Bible, but it could be to an image, an object, a word, a thought, to anything. So that's contemplation. And as I say, although thought may form an important part of this, more fundamentally, contemplation is always more than thinking. It's absorption. This is a key concept. It involves being lost in this reflective pondering, whatever you're pondering in your heart and in your body. So the essence of contemplation, I would say, is absorption that includes reflective pondering, but it's more a matter of the heart than of the mind. Now, what can we say about meditation? Meditation's, again, described in many ways, but my own definition would be the following. Meditation is wordless, thoughtless, imageless presence in which whatever comes into awareness is released as you return to a place of emptiness and openness. Again, let me read it again. Wordless, it's ineffable. It's not just thinking. Thoughtless, it in fact involves a release of thoughts. Imageless, not focusing on a piece of art or an image. Presence in whatever comes into awareness is released as you return to a place of emptiness and openness. Well, these definitions are my own. I didn't receive them on a mountaintop and carved in tablets of stone, but maybe they put us on the same page, so we're thinking about the same things. Similarities in importance. Both contemplation and meditation are routes to emptiness and openness. And I'll come back to this later. This is very important. Both are ways to empty ourselves and in trusting openness to live out of that place. Normally, I would say we're too full of ourselves to be empty enough to be truly open. Acts of contemplation or meditation open us in our depths by shifting us from our heads to our hearts and our bodies. But there are lots of differences. And what I want to do now is to map contemplation and meditation and help you see the breadth of activities and modes of being that this involves. So we're going to look at contemplative and meditative practices. And those practices we'll put on this one axis of my little chart. And I could describe them as being on a continuum between prayer, which is more relational, and meditation, which is more instrumental. So contemplation itself, actually all of these things, let's now take them in their combined form, involve practices. And I will chart them in a way that shows the ones that are more relational, closer to the top, the ones that are more instrumental, that is to accomplish something, to have practice, to use this time as practice in openness, for example, and release. They'll be closer to the bottom. But there's a second axis. Let's talk about these as paths. So there's practices and paths. And I'll fill the screen with some possibilities to show that. Well, again, the paths can be placed on a continuum. The classic language, particularly in the Christian tradition, this hasn't been used much outside the Christian tradition, has been to think of practices that are very focused. And this has been historically called cataphatic. So the cataphatic approach to contemplation. The word's not important, but at least this puts in our map these two terms, cataphatic and apophatic, in case you're familiar with them. So over on this side of the screen, we're going to be looking at very focused approaches. And on the other side, more emptying approaches. It's not focusing on anything. The focus really is emptying. Now, let me just stop for one quick second and then we'll move into this. Sometimes I hear people saying, well, emptying isn't a Christian process. In fact, they fear it. They think that it's dangerous. There's nothing in the Christian spiritual life if it doesn't involve letting go, release, death, descent. These are the cores of the Christian path. And emptiness isn't something to be feared, nor is it a precondition to being filled. It's a doorway to knowing the fullness of emptiness, the fullness that can only be experienced and known in a state of emptiness. That's paradoxical, but intentionally so, because so much of the spiritual life, of course, can only be communicated by paradoxes. So let's now start to fill in our chart. Practices, paths, what do we have? Well, again, this perhaps further complicates it, but I hope it will help. I'm going to sort these practices into three major categories. And the first is practices that are primarily mental, that involve the will, that is, they're volitional. And a very good example of that would be centering prayer. You set aside time in centering prayer to be still, to focus, and then to release anything that comes into oneself as a distraction and to return to silence and openness. I'm not going to be teaching any of these today, so you perhaps already know centering prayer, perhaps you're already practicing it. It's powerful and important prayer practice, perhaps the most distinctively Christian of the things that we'll talk about. But everything that I'll describe has Christian forms and non-Christian forms. And there certainly are examples of contemplative or meditative practices that are virtually identical to centering prayer in other traditions. So centering prayer gives us one example. Now, further down at the level of meditation, so this is closer to prayer, the level of meditation, that is to accomplish something. We have mindfulness practices, very popular, very powerful, lots of applications in psychology, medicine, other fields that I won't be talking about today, but unquestionably of value, great powerfulness. And let's just leave it there. Welcoming practices would be another example. This is the practice. I've talked about this in some places, some of my books, and I believe that there's some YouTube teaching videos related to it. If they're not up yet, they'll be up soon. But the welcoming practice involves the totally counterintuitive idea of accepting, embracing, welcoming that which is. It takes the things in our life that might be naturally unwelcome and says, you are part of my present realities. I welcome you. And that changes all sorts of things. So here we have something that's also down in this meditative realm because it involves action, will, thinking. Let's look at some practices that are more embodied because all of these so far are mental. And the more it's embedded in our bodies, and the third component that I'll add in a few moments, the more it's involved at that level also, the deeper its effect on our being. So let's look at practices that have an embodied component. Breath work, it's a very good example. In every spiritual tradition I have ever encountered, there is an honoring of the importance of attending to one's breath. I actually didn't know that it was a Christian practice until I was working with a friend who was a Taoist, and he was teaching me the important place that breath and attention to breath holds within Taoism. And he said, but of course, you know, you have the same in your tradition, and you have much more of a theological foundation for it, because your creation story tells us that humans are the breath of God enlivening dust. And so he went on to, he taught me Christian approaches to breath work. But as I say, it's not a Christian practice. It's not a non-Christian practice. It's a practice of attending to breath. And I think that it is more powerful than the things that we already have up there in black because it moves us into our bodies. It's a singularly important practice. And there are lots of ways of doing it. And there are examples of guided meditations on breath on this channel. But acts of creativity would be another example. Making music, writing a poem, writing a play, drawing, painting, not listening to music, not simply looking at paintings. Those kinds of things have an important role in contemplation. But if we want to move it into our body, we bring an action to this component of creativity. So the making of things, acts of creativity, let's just call it. Another example would be sensoring awakening. If you've gone through the 365-day teaching video series on awakening, you'll know, you'll have had quite a bit of practice in doing that. I begin every morning with a number of things, but one of them is a sensory awakening walk. I get outside with whatever amount of time I have, and I open my senses as a way of being fully present in my body. Sensory awakening, more focused. So it's in the cataphatic end of this, definitely embodied. And well, let me just leave it at that point. Embodied presence. Presence is always embodied. We can think that we're being present to someone or something, but if our bodies aren't present, we're not present to ourselves. Our own presence to ourselves must always be an embodied presence. So that's why I combine the words embodied and presence. Being intentionally present to myself is the doorway then to being present to anything or anybody, a deep body meditative practice. Heart pondering is pondering the things that arise in our bodies, in our hearts. Being not thinking about them. It's noticing what is here, not judging, evaluating, trying to understand, but taking it and being present to it. That's heart pondering. Again, much more could be said about that. And it's something I've been teaching often and long. And so you'll find it in my books and other YouTube videos. So we come to the third component, mental and volitional, not quite as deep as when it's embodied, but there are some practices that intentionally move us into the deeper realms of consciousness, that is, into our unconscious. Let's just look at a couple quickly. A very Christian prayer form is the prayer of senses and imagination, associated with and developed by St. Francis, and quite central to the Ignatian spiritual exercises. What is it? Well, it's prayerful engagement with your senses and your imagination. Let's just leave it there. There's lots more that again could be said about that, but you can learn more about it in other places. Still within the Christian tradition, the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner, in any of its many variations. Lord, have mercy. But it's a mantra prayer because it's repeated over and over. Why is it repeated? It's repeated over and over so that it might sink into our unconscious. I've practiced mantra prayers, starting with the Jesus prayer in my 20s when I first read the little book, The Way of a Pilgrim, the story of an anonymous Russian pilgrim walking back and forth across the length of Russia, praying the Jesus prayer. And this was the origins of the Jesus prayer in the Russian Orthodox tradition. But if you pray anything repetitively, repeating a simple few set of words, it moves into your depths. After doing that for many years, I can't set out walking in solitude. If I'm walking with someone, there's likely conversation and it interrupts it. If I walk in solitude, this prayer, the Jesus prayer, arises within me and begins to pray itself. Why? Because mantra prayers become prayers of the unconscious. It becomes prayers praying their way through us. Liturgy. This is really lost as churches, particularly Protestant churches, have moved away from liturgy and moved into other modes of what happens in what's called a worship service. But liturgy of the old kind, I understand why in the years before the Reformation and before the Mass became even in English, why praying and listening to a service that you wouldn't have understood, the Mass was in Latin. Why did that become so powerful? Because it reaches deep parts of oneself. We don't have to be listening for liturgy to get inside of us. And I've spent enough years in high Anglo-Catholic masses a tradition where there's chanting of the Psalms and singing of the creeds. And that singing may not involve singing it in English, not so that you can think about it, but so that these things move deep within you. And again, these prayers, forms of prayers, pray themselves through me now, all the time. I'll wake up first thing in the morning and have not been in a liturgical service for perhaps a long time, but the liturgy prays itself through me. Well, liturgy moves deep. And there's just one other example, and that is that any form of meditation that involves movement. Thomas Merton, on seeing for the first time the whirling dervishes of Sufism, which is the somewhat esoteric and tradition within Islam, his first impression remained with him, and that was that this is pure meditation because it's embodied, didn't involve words. And so walking meditation does that. When I was more active in leading retreats and teaching meditation within retreat contexts, usually within the context of a 5-day silent retreat, where we'd come together for an hour of conversation, and then people would spend the day in solitude. And often we would hold those hours walking because we would practice a movement-based meditation. Now, that's a very quick overview. You can go back to this slide. It's one of the reasons I put it up anytime, and you can read more about it. I give some other examples in other traditions, Qigong or yoga, popular and well-known and very powerful ways of practicing meditation through movement. Very briefly, as we wrap up, why are contemplation and meditation important? Well, both are ways to openness and emptiness. That, as I said before, is what they share in common. They open up inner space by giving us an opportunity to practice detachment from our normal preoccupations. This is why they're so important. They allow us to practice. If you're new, if you've never practiced any form of meditation before, be patient with yourself. But remember, it's practice. That's why it's called a practice. It's practicing detachment from our normal preoccupations, the things we think about, particularly from our minds, and thinking, evaluating, judging, and classifying, which are mental processes that many of us spend much of our day engaging with. Meditation is a way of letting go of that. Contemplation, similarly, so remember, what is it? It's that focused thing, contemplating a leaf, contemplating the ripples on a body of water as I am able to observe as I look out my window at the moment. Contemplating anything is a doorway to everything. Contemplation and meditation are important because they invite us to be empty. And this is the foundation of true openness. I expect I'll be saying more about this in future teaching videos. I've certainly said lots about it in my books and in my blogs. And some of these things have been part of what I have taught and spoken of in other earlier videos on this channel. But I'm sure I'm going to come back to this. And in fact, I want to use what we've done today in a little longer session as a springboard in the future to come back and look at some of these practices. And also this concept, this vitally important concept of the incredible value of emptiness if we wish to be truly open and truly full. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for being with me. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now. Be well.